The light in that window did not just burn, it accused. Night after night, while the town of Westchester slept beneath snow-choked branches and moaning chimneys, a single square of gold remained alive on the second floor of the Halden estate. People whispered about it in diners over burnt coffee, in gas stations where the radio kept loneliness company, even in the hushed aisles of the grocery store. A house was meant to rest at night. A child was meant to rest most of all. But that window never closed. The estate itself was a ship of stone and glass stranded in a sea of white. By day it dazzled with wealth. By night it looked like a mausoleum of promises. Statues of athletes and scholars lined the drive, silent witnesses to triumph. Yet no laughter lived in the halls. Only that glow above, haunting as a candle in a tomb. The story, of course, had many versions. Some said the child inside was ill. Others swore she was brilliant, or cursed, or simply unwilling to speak. A few insisted she was not truly the rich man's daughter, but a charity case, plucked from tragedy for the sake of a photograph. All agreed on one thing. The window belonged to a girl who never smiled. Her name was Clara. 10 years old, small enough to vanish in the gray wool coat she had worn on the day she arrived. The newspaper clipping still survived in the town archives. George Halden, magnate and benefactor, adopting an orphaned child after a winter fire. The article praised his generosity, printing his name in bold type. But Clara's face was barely visible in the photo, half-turned, half lost in shadow. George told the world he did it out of responsibility. In truth, he did it because silence had begun to suffocate his home. His fortune could buy glass towers and marble foyers, but not the sound of a child's voice. Clara, he hoped, would fill that hollow. Yet from the first day, her world was one of windows. She entered the great hall quietly, left crescents of thawed snow on the stone floor, and carried only a satchel of pencils and smoke-scented notebooks. She nodded politely, but no words came. When asked where she wanted to sit, she pointed to the window in her new bedroom. So a chair was placed there, then another when she outgrew the first. Books and colored pencils filled the sill, paper stars decorated the frame, but Clara remained facing outward, as if waiting for something the world had not yet delivered. The first night George noticed the light still burning past midnight, he felt relief. At least she was awake, engaged, alive. By the fourth night, unease gnawed at him. The light seemed less like comfort, and more like defiance. He responded the only way he knew. He paid. Therapists, tutors, specialists came with briefcases and carefully modulated voices. They asked about trust and trauma, charted graphs, proposed pets, suggested music lessons. Clara listened and said nothing. When they left, the window stayed lit. Down in the village, the stories grew wilder. Some claimed she was waiting for her real family. Others said she was cursed to keep the light alive until the truth was spoken. The old man on the diner stool muttered that sometimes a person sits by a window until the world looks safe enough to walk into. No one disagreed. Then, one gray morning, a man named Samuel arrived. He was not a specialist. He carried no degrees, no instruments, only a canvas bag and a pair of weathered boots. To the estate manager, he was the gardener. To himself, he was simply a man who needed work. He had buried a wife, lived in rented rooms, and learned the patience of small good deeds, pruning dead wood, lifting wet leaves, planting against frost. He did not ask about the stories of the house. He asked where the tools were kept. They sent him to clear branches on the eastern lawn. He worked quietly for hours, his breath turning steady in the cold. When he straightened, he saw it, that window, glowing even in daylight. It stopped him, not by brightness but by constancy. It looked like a lantern hung for someone lost at sea. He stood a moment, gloved hand over his mouth, then bent again to his task. That night, Clara pressed her palm to the glass. She had seen him, this man bending in the frost with the seriousness of prayer. He had not looked at her directly, not tried to coax or intrude, only tended the soil as though it mattered. Something inside her stirred. For the first time, her hand lingered on the window pane as if answering a question no one had asked aloud. Samuel, in his small room across town, opened a packet of seeds he had bought without reason. He wondered why. He did not know a child's gaze had followed him that morning. He did not know his days had begun to bend toward a silent square of light. By dawn, frost still clung to the earth, but Samuel knelt in the garden and pressed the first seed into the soil. He planted not because it was the right season, it was not, but because something stronger than weather urged him on. Inside, Clara stood again at the window, watching. For the briefest moment, the golden light of her room and the pale winter sun aligned, and the world, for once, looked almost warm. The window did not close, and the story of the house on the hill had quietly begun. Silence is heavier when it belongs to a child. Most people believed children's quiet could be coaxed away with laughter, toys, or sweet promises. But the silence that wrapped itself around Clara was different. It was not shyness, nor fear of strangers. It was a fortress, one she had carried from the ashes of her old life into the stone corridors of the Halden estate. Clara's days followed a pattern that unnerved the staff. She rose early, slipping from bed before dawn lit the sky, and returned to her chair by the window. There she sat, motionless, watching the world beyond glass. She did not play with dolls left discreetly on her desk. She did not touch the piano that had been polished until its keys gleamed. She accepted meals politely, sometimes nibbling bread, often ignoring the rest. And always, she returned to the window, as though waiting for something to approach from the garden below. George Halden could not bear it. He was a man used to action, a man who solved problems by throwing resources at them. If a company failed, he bought it. If a competitor rose, he outbid them. If a scandal whispered, he buried it with headlines twice as loud. But his daughter's silence? He could not purchase its end. He called in experts. Dr. Lysander, child psychologist, entered with soft shoes and a voice that dripped calm. "Children in trauma," he explained, "create safe spaces. This window is her anchor." He asked permission to sit near Clara. She did not object, nor acknowledge him. He spoke of colors and shapes, of memories and dreams. Clara listened with her eyes on the frost outside. When he asked her to draw, she lifted her pencil and traced only the outline of the window itself. Another specialist brought a therapy dog. The golden retriever wagged, pressed its warm head against her knee. For a moment her hand hovered as if to stroke it, but then, as though recalling something forbidden, she withdrew. The dog whimpered. The handler declared progress anyway. Yet when they left, Clara returned to her watch at the glass. The estate filled with suggestions, music lessons, play dates, a tutor in mathematics, even an art therapist who placed clay in Clara's hands and encouraged her to shape what words could not. Clara pressed the clay once, twice, and then molded it into a small square block. A window again. George grew restless. He stalked the halls at night, his phone glowing in his palm, negotiating deals that seemed simpler than the mystery under his own roof. When he passed Clara's room and saw the golden light cutting across the hallway, he felt a strange mixture of failure and fear. Was he losing her? Or had he never truly had her at all? Meanwhile, Samuel worked quietly in the garden. The earth was frozen, but he labored anyway, clearing branches, preparing soil, and leaving small offerings beneath Clara's window. A crooked row of snowdrops, a rescued bird's nest, even a pebble smoothed by the stream. He never looked up, but he knew, somehow, that she was watching. One morning, Clara did something unexpected. She placed a sheet of paper on the sill. On it, in careful pencil strokes, she had drawn not only her window but the faint outline of a man bending in the garden. No face, no detail, just the posture of someone tending the earth. The housekeeper found it while dusting and carried it, puzzled, to George. "She's drawing," the woman whispered. "This is good, isn't it?" George studied the sketch. His jaw tightened. The figure was unmistakable. Not a therapist, not a tutor, not even himself, but the gardener. That evening, George confronted Samuel by the tool shed. "My daughter is not your concern," he said, voice low with warning. "You are here to trim hedges, not play savior." Samuel, weary but steady, met his gaze. "I've spoken no word to her, sir. I only work the ground." George's eyes narrowed. "Then keep your eyes on the ground. Do not let her fix her hopes on you. Do you understand?" Samuel nodded, but in his heart, he knew something George could not admit. It was not hope he was offering. It was presence. And presence, sometimes, was the one thing money could not command. That night, the window glowed again. Clara sat with her paper stars above her, the sketch of the gardener tucked beneath her pillow. Outside, Samuel sowed another row of seeds, though frost would likely kill them. He did it anyway. For him, for her, for the promise that even in silence, something might grow. In the grand hall, George Halden poured himself a glass of whiskey. The fire cracked but gave no warmth. He told himself he had done everything right, hired the best, spent without limit, offered a palace to a child who had nothing. And yet, upstairs, she remained untouched, unreachable, choosing instead to gaze at the dirt-stained figure in the garden. The truth, though George could not yet name it, was simple. Clara did not need saving. She needed someone who did not try to force her world open. She needed someone who tended it quietly until she chose to step through the door herself. And so the silent winter deepened. The snow thickened on the lawns, the specialists came and went, and the estate whispered with frustration. But the girl by the window and the man in the garden were already weaving a language beyond sound. It began with seeds in frozen soil. It began with drawings no one else understood. It began, as many miracles do, in silence. Money can silence scandal, command armies of experts, and build towers from glass and steel, but it cannot teach a child to laugh. George Halden had spent his life proving that wealth was a shield. When markets crashed, he remained standing. When rivals schemed, he outbid them. When whispers rose in boardrooms, he drowned them with headlines. But in his own home, a single child's silence defeated him. The more he tried to solve it, the more it mocked the limits of his fortune. At first, George approached Clara's quiet with optimism. She was grieving, he told himself. Time heals. His staff assured him that children adapt quickly when surrounded by comfort, but weeks turned into months, and the mansion remained as hollow as before. Clara moved like a ghost through corridors lined with oil paintings. Meals passed in silence, punctuated only by the clatter of silver against porcelain. Her laughter, the sound George had once imagined echoing through these halls, never came. Frustration hardened into obsession. George hired the best tutors from New York and Boston. They arrived with glowing resumes and soft voices, carrying promises of breakthroughs. One played music, hoping to coax Clara into rhythm. Another brought puzzles and word games, trying to draw her into dialogue. A third filled her room with paints, urging her to splash color across canvas. Each attempt ended the same way. Clara by the window, her face pressed to the glass, watching the garden below. It was Samuel she drew again and again, his bent figure, his hands in the soil, the arc of his back like a bridge between silence and the earth. She never showed these sketches to anyone but kept them stacked beneath her pillow. George noticed, and it unsettled him. He began to study Samuel from a distance. Through the wide office window, he watched the gardener labor with a steadiness that no frost could break. Samuel never seemed hurried, never seemed to notice he was being observed. He raked, dug, trimmed, and planted with a patience that mocked George's restless need for results. One evening, unable to contain his bitterness, George muttered aloud, "What does he give her that I cannot?" The words startled even him. The answer, of course, was presence. Samuel did not ask Clara to speak. He did not bribe her with gifts or promise miracles. He worked, and in that work she saw something steady enough to trust. But George was a man trained to see competition in every shadow. To him, Samuel was not a quiet gardener. He was a rival, and rivals had to be managed. He summoned the estate manager. "The gardener," he said coldly. "Keep him away from the east wing. The girl must not be distracted." The order was followed in form, but not in spirit. Samuel still worked where the soil called for him, and Clara's eyes still sought him through the glass. The staff noticed. Whispers spread in the kitchen. The girl responds only to the gardener. George's authority trembled. The breaking point came one afternoon in early March. George, returning from a tense board meeting, found Clara's latest drawing on her desk. It was different. She had sketched not only Samuel but also herself, standing beside him in the garden. No window separated them. She had given herself a smile. George's hand trembled as he held the paper. A storm rose in him. Jealousy, sorrow, fury. He wanted to tear it in half but could not. Instead, he crumpled it and shoved it into his coat pocket, as though hiding it from the world could erase what it revealed. That night, he poured glass after glass of whiskey by the fire. His thoughts circled endlessly. Why had his money failed? Why had the child chosen a man who had nothing to offer? For years, George had believed wealth was proof of worth. Now, under the accusing glow of his daughter's window, he began to feel poorer than ever. Meanwhile, Clara pressed her face to the cold glass, waiting. Below, Samuel had left another small offering, a cluster of early crocuses, violet against the snow. She placed her hand to the window as if reaching toward them. For the first time since the fire that had taken her old life, her lips curved into something almost like a smile. George did not see it. He was downstairs, drowning in amber liquid, too blind to notice the one thing his fortune could never command. By the end of that week, the household had divided itself silently into two camps, those who believed the specialists could still reach the girl, and those who knew the gardener already had. George fought to cling to the first camp, because to admit the second would mean admitting that money had failed him. Yet even as he resisted, the truth grew clearer. The child's silence was not emptiness, it was choice. She had chosen her witness, and that witness was not her father. For George Halden, who had spent his life buying loyalty, that realization cut deeper than any business loss. It was not the market that had collapsed this time. It was the myth of his power. And somewhere in the dark garden, Samuel planted another row of seeds, stubborn against the frost, as Clara's window burned on. He arrived with no keys to any room, only the patience to wait outside. Samuel lived simply. A rented room, a dented tin pot for coffee, and a canvas bag filled with tools older than he was. He rose before dawn, caught the first bus, and slipped through the service gate of the Halden estate, with the quiet of someone who had learned not to disturb. The grounds in late winter looked lifeless, beds crusted with frost, hedges brittle, fountains frozen into silence. Yet above the eastern slope, one thing still lived: a square of gold in the second-floor window. A child was awake. Samuel did not look up. He began where neglect hides, clearing drains, pruning branches, loosening soil that should not yet have softened. By mid-morning, he found a patch of earth thawed early beneath that very window. He knelt and planted snowdrop bulbs, pressing them into the ground with the same steadiness he once gave to his late wife's trembling hand. Inside, Clara watched. She pressed her palm against the glass and mirrored his movements without realizing it. Each rake, each careful bend toward the soil seemed to build a rhythm her silence could understand. The house had its own rhythm, too. Therapists scribbling notes, tutors unpacking puzzles, a chef trying recipes a child might love. George Halden moved between calls, restless and unsatisfied. Yet outside, Samuel spoke in a different language, the language of presence. That afternoon, he discovered a robin with a broken wing under the laurel. He built a nest from his scarf, set down water in a bottle cap, and left seed from his pocket tin. He did not stroke it or whisper comfort. He simply stayed. Clara saw everything. For the first time since the fire that had taken her old life, she reached for paper and drew, not the window, but the bird in Samuel's scarf. She placed the sketch on her sill, weighted with a pebble, a gesture small yet braver than words. The next morning, Samuel found it. He did not look up at her window. He never broke that law of distance, but he studied the drawing, then tucked it carefully into his bag. When he returned to his work, his movements carried a new kind of reverence. George noticed none of this. He was told only that the gardener lingered too near the east wing. Furious, he ordered the staff to keep Samuel away from Clara's view, but Samuel could not lie to the soil. He continued planting, pruning, and, when the robin died, burying it beneath the laurel with pansies laid gently above. Clara watched with both hands against the glass, her eyes wide with recognition. The next day, Samuel made something small from fallen branches, 3 sticks arranged into a square frame, like a tiny window on the ground. It was not decoration, but a quiet answer, a way of saying, "I see you, and I will wait." Clara gasped softly. For the first time, she lifted her sash an inch, letting the cold air slip into her room. The paper stars above her trembled. She leaned her ear to the gap and listened. No words, no song, only the rustle of branches. Yet it was enough. That night, the light in her window glowed not as an accusation, but as a signal. The gardener had not entered her room, had not spoken her name. But somehow, her silence had found its first reply. Sometimes the smallest gesture carries more weight than all the voices in a house. It began with the square of sticks Samuel had arranged in the garden, a little frame pressed into frozen soil. To anyone else it was nothing, a careless pattern. To Clara, it was a mirror. She had drawn windows again and again, not knowing why. Now, outside her own, one waited for her. For the first time in months, she felt as though someone understood without demanding a single word. That morning, she opened her sash a full hand's width. The rush of cold startled her lungs, but she did not close it. She slipped one of her sketches, of the robin in Samuel's scarf, onto the sill. She weighed it down with a pebble and left it for him to find. Then she retreated to her chair, heart beating too loudly for silence. Samuel discovered it just before noon. He crouched, studied the lines of the child's pencil, and held the paper as if it were fragile glass. He did not look up to the window. He simply nodded once, tucked it carefully into his coat, and went back to planting. That nod, unnoticed by anyone else, reached Clara like sunlight through frost. The staff began to whisper. A maid, dusting Clara's desk, noticed fewer untouched toys and more sketches. A cook saw her pause at the kitchen door, sniffing the aroma of bread before hurrying away. "She's waking," the maid murmured, "but not for us." George Halden felt the shift too. He had built his fortune on control, of markets, of narratives, of people, but his daughter was slipping beyond it. He walked the corridors like a man guarding a fortress whose gates had quietly swung open. Each time he passed her room and saw the light spilling out, he clenched his jaw. That light was no longer his to explain. One afternoon, George stood at his office window and saw Clara's sash ajar. Below, Samuel worked steadily, shoulders bent, unaware of, or unwilling to acknowledge, the scrutiny. George's fury boiled. Was he losing his daughter to a gardener? To a man who owned nothing but patience? That evening he confronted Clara. "Why do you keep the window open?" he demanded, his voice harsher than he intended. Clara looked at him, truly looked, and then turned back to the glass without a word. For the first time, George felt the sting of being shut out. Meanwhile, Samuel answered in the only way he knew. The next morning he laid a single crocus blossom on the stone ledge beneath her window. It was absurd. It was March, the cold still cruel, but he had forced the bulbs early in a clay pot at home. Clara saw it and pressed both hands to the glass. No laughter escaped her lips, but her shoulders trembled with something close to joy. It was then that the specialists began to lose authority. Their charts, their plans, their carefully worded notes, none of it mattered beside a single flower left by calloused hands. George dismissed 2 of them in a single week, his frustration turning to quiet panic. If money could not fix this, what could? The household divided. Some staff clung to George's belief in therapy and routine. Others whispered that the gardener had done more with silence than experts had with all their words. The truth was undeniable. Clara responded only when Samuel was near, even if near meant 50 feet below her window. One evening, snow began again, heavy and wet. Samuel worked until dusk, clearing paths so the girl's view of the garden would not vanish entirely. When at last he stopped, he turned, just once, and lifted his hand. Not a wave, not an invitation, simply a presence, a steady line drawn across the storm. Clara's breath caught. Then, slowly, she raised her hand too, palm against the pane. For the first time since the fire that had stolen her world, she allowed herself to answer. George did not see it. He was downstairs, drowning another glass of whiskey, staring at the fire that gave no warmth. The next morning, Clara left her boldest offering yet, a sketch of herself standing in the garden beside the man she had drawn so many times. In the drawing, she was smiling. Samuel found it, studied it with reverence, and placed it gently back on the stone so she would know he had understood. His throat tightened, though no words escaped. Some silences are not barriers. They are bridges. By nightfall, the entire estate felt the change. The child in the window was no longer unreachable. She had chosen someone to reach toward. And that choice, fragile, defiant, unpurchased, was the first step out of her fortress of silence. The window still burned against the winter dark, but now it did not accuse. It invited. Some seeds wait for years beneath the earth before daring to rise. For Clara, silence had been that seed. It buried itself deep after the fire that swallowed her first home, after voices she loved were silenced forever. She had carried that silence into the Halden estate like luggage no one could lift from her shoulders. But now, for the first time, something pressed from below. Small, fragile, but alive. It began with the crocus. The little violet flower Samuel had forced early in a clay pot stood beneath her window as if it had broken an agreement with winter. Every morning she looked for it, half afraid it would wither overnight. But each day it remained, defying the frost. She began to sketch it obsessively, one drawing after another, sometimes with Samuel's bent figure beside it, sometimes alone, a symbol of her own breath learning to return. The staff noticed the change. Clara no longer stayed at the window all day. Sometimes she paced, clutching her notebook. Sometimes she slipped the sash open wider, letting cold air swirl through her room until the maid shivered and begged her to close it. Once, the cook caught her near the kitchen door, lingering over the smell of baking bread. She fled at once, but the cook smiled. "She's coming back," she whispered. George Halden did not smile. He saw the crocus as an intruder. Each time he glanced from his office window and saw Clara's gaze fixed downward, a knot tightened in his chest. It was Samuel, always Samuel. The gardener's presence had become a challenge to everything George believed, that money, authority, and design could fix any flaw. One evening he confronted Samuel again. "My daughter is not your project," he said coldly by the shed. "Stay away from her." Samuel wiped his hands on his coat, met George's eyes, and replied softly, "I've never gone near her. She comes near me." It was the truth, and George hated him for it. That night, George paced the hall outside Clara's door. He almost entered, almost demanded that she explain herself. But when he saw her asleep in her chair, sketch clutched to her chest, the light still glowing over her, he could not. He turned away, haunted by the thought that he was not the one she trusted. Meanwhile, Samuel's quiet gestures multiplied. He repaired a broken birdhouse and placed it where Clara could see. He planted pansies along the path, each bloom defying the season. He even left a smooth stone shaped like a heart beneath the window ledge. He did not sign his work. He did not need to. Presence was its own signature. Clara began answering. More drawings appeared on the sill. A flower trembling against snow, a tiny bird resting in a hand, sometimes a simple square of window with light streaming through it. Each morning Samuel found them, studied them with reverence, and placed them back exactly as she left them. The conversation continued wordlessly, a dialogue stronger than speech. One morning, the impossible happened. Clara laughed. It was small, almost hidden, a sharp breath that startled even her. The maid carrying fresh linen froze in the doorway, eyes wide. Clara quickly pressed her hand to her mouth, as though the sound had broken a rule. But it was too late. It had happened. The rumor spread through the household faster than fire. "She laughed," the cook whispered. The girl laughed. George heard it too. For one blinding moment, hope surged in him. But when he asked what had caused it, the answer burned. Clara had been watching Samuel scatter seed in the garden. A flock of sparrows had descended, pecking greedily. Samuel, startled, flailed his arms like a scarecrow, and Clara had laughed. George retreated to his office with the taste of bitterness on his tongue. He poured a drink and told himself it meant nothing. But deep inside, he knew it meant everything. The window, once a prison, was becoming a doorway. Clara was leaning outward, not inward. And it was the gardener, not her father, who had given her a reason. By late March, the crocus withered. Clara noticed first, eyes filling with dread. But Samuel had prepared for this. The next morning, a new bloom appeared, pansies this time, stubborn and bright. He planted them in a neat row, each one a defiance against despair. When Clara saw them, she pressed both palms to the glass and whispered, so softly she hardly believed it herself, "Thank you." The word did not reach Samuel's ears, but it changed her. For once, silence had cracked. That night, as snow melted into rivulets along the garden path, Clara did not leave her lamp burning from fear. She left it burning as invitation. The seed that had slept inside her for so long had stirred. It had not yet broken the surface. But spring was coming, and no wall of glass could hold it forever. Every small miracle collects a critic before it gathers a witness. By March, the Halden estate could feel the change. Clara's silence was loosening. She lingered at the window, sketched flowers instead of walls, and once, startling even herself, she laughed. The sound slipped out when Samuel waved his arms at sparrows raiding his seed. To the staff, it was a marvel. To George, it was a wound. His daughter had given her first laugh, not to him, but to the gardener. Fear disguised itself as policy. The estate manager delivered the new rule. Samuel must keep to the west grounds. She needs focus, not distractions, the experts agreed. Their voices were calm, their charts confident. Their solution was simple. Curtain the window, reduce unscripted variables. That evening, a motorized blind slid down over Clara's view. She stood still, palm against the fabric, feeling nothing. The golden square of light became a muted rectangle. The world had declared her safest when cut off. Samuel saw the blind the next morning. He said nothing, only bent to plant hellebores nearby. Before leaving, he scratched a small symbol into a stone, a circle with a line through it, like a door left ajar. Clara noticed. That night she pushed the sash open against the blind and dropped one of her drawings through the gap. It showed the little twig window he had once built. Beneath it, in careful letters, a single word: stay. Samuel found it, bowed his head, and answered with stones. 4 smooth river pebbles laid into a square, a permanent window the house could not throw away. But the house tried to scorn him still. Staff muttered about sentimentality. George told himself he was protecting Clara from dependency, yet scorn could not stop what was already alive. Then, one night, the power failed. The great mansion groaned into darkness. In Clara's room, the blind froze halfway, useless. For the first time all winter, her window turned black. She pushed the sash open, heart racing, and below, a light moved. Samuel had stayed in the shed through the storm. Now he stepped into the garden with an old lantern. He carried it to the square of stones and set it glowing. A circle of warmth rose into the night, small but unshaken. Clara pressed her mouth to the gap and whispered the first word she had spoken in that house. Wait. The wind stole it, but the lantern kept it. By dawn, power returned. The blind rose again, as if nothing had happened. The staff pretended the night was only an inconvenience, but for Clara, the truth had already broken through. Someone outside the rules had answered her silence. The golden window no longer accused. It had begun to open. Some doors are locked with keys, others with fear. Clara had lived for months behind her golden window, watching but never crossing. The garden below had become her world, flowers planted in frost, a robin rescued, stones arranged into a window of their own. Samuel spoke nothing to her, yet his silence was different from hers. His silence waited. After the night of the lantern, something shifted. Clara whispered her first word, wait, into the storm. No one but the wind carried it, but she felt lighter. A seed inside her had cracked. The next morning she opened her sash wider. The blind rattled uselessly, as though it knew it had failed. She leaned out just far enough to see the square of stones, where the lantern had burned. Samuel was already there, kneeling, brushing snow from the hellebores. He did not look up, but he placed a new object within the stone frame, a tiny wreath of twined willow, green against the gray earth. Clara's chest tightened. She searched her room for something to answer with. At last, she chose her bravest drawing yet, herself, standing outside the window, holding Samuel's hand. She folded it and dropped it carefully through the gap. When Samuel found it, he froze. His throat worked, but no words came. He pressed the paper to his chest, then returned it to the sill so she would know he understood. For the first time, he lifted his eyes. Only for a moment. But it was enough. That evening, the staff discovered the wreath. To them, it was litter, a trespass on the careful symmetry of the estate. The housekeeper tried to remove it, but Clara banged her palm against the glass until she stopped. Shocked, the woman left it alone. It was the first time Clara had made noise for anyone but herself. George heard about it within the hour. His jaw tightened. "The gardener is undermining her treatment," he muttered. He summoned Samuel to his office. "You are overstepping," George said coldly. "She needs professionals, not—" He glanced at the dirt-stained coat, the calloused hands. "A distraction." Samuel held his ground. "I've never asked her for anything. She chooses." George's anger burned hotter because it was true. That night, whiskey in hand, George walked the dark corridors and stopped outside Clara's room. Through the blind's thin fabric, he saw her lamp glow. She was seated at her desk, drawing furiously. For the first time, he wondered whether she was not silent because she was broken, but because she had already chosen who was worth answering. Meanwhile, Clara's sketches grew bolder. She drew not only Samuel, but herself beyond the window, standing in gardens, walking paths, smiling. She began to tape them along the walls of her room. The silence inside her no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a door that trembled on its hinges. One afternoon, when snow finally melted into rivulets along the stone path, she tested that door. She slipped from her room, bare feet cold on the polished floor, and padded down the grand staircase. At the glass back door, she froze. Her heart hammered. Her hand shook on the handle. On the other side, Samuel was kneeling by the flower beds, unaware. For a long moment, she only watched him. The world narrowed to the steady rhythm of his hands in the soil. Then she turned the handle. The latch clicked. The door opened a fraction before the estate manager appeared. "Miss Clara!" he barked, more startled than harsh. She gasped and darted back, retreating up the stairs, vanishing into her room before the man could follow. The door closed again, but it had opened. That evening, Clara did not sit in silence. She pressed her palm to the glass and whispered another word into the night. Soon. No one else heard it. Samuel, brushing dirt from his palms, felt only a shift in the air, as though the garden itself had promised him spring. The window no longer simply glowed. It quivered with the weight of a choice waiting to be made. Every voice that rises from silence threatens someone who profits from the quiet. By April, Clara had begun to change in ways the Halden estate could no longer ignore. She whispered small words into her pillow at night. Wait. Soon. Light. She dared to slip her sash open wider, letting fresh air whip her paper stars into motion. She had even touched the back door, though fear had dragged her upstairs again. To most in the house, these were signs of healing. To George, they felt like betrayal. His daughter was blooming, but not for him. The experts returned with more charts, more theories. Her attachment is misplaced, they insisted. She projects safety onto the gardener. Remove the stimulus and her dependency will collapse. George, exhausted and desperate, listened, and so the order was given. Samuel was to be dismissed. The staff heard first. Whispers traveled through the kitchen and hallways. Some nodded. It's for the best. Others frowned. She'll break. But no one dared question aloud. Power in that house did not tolerate dissent. Clara learned in the cruelest way. She woke one morning to find the garden empty. The bed beneath her window lay bare, tools removed, No lantern, no wreath, no man. At first, she thought it was chance. By afternoon, she realized the truth. Samuel was gone. Her silence, once chosen, became a scream without sound. She refused meals. She tore the blind from its frame, ripping fabric with a ferocity no one had seen in her. When George entered, trying to soothe, she turned her back. She sketched wildly, page after page of flowers uprooted, stones scattered, a window with no figure beneath it. She taped them to the walls until the room itself became a protest. That night, the golden square of light glared brighter than ever. To the town below, it looked like defiance. To George, pacing his study, it felt like judgment. But Samuel had not gone far. Dismissal had not erased his presence. He rented no new job, took no new ground. Instead, he lingered in the village, walking past the estate gates at dawn, leaving small offerings where he dared. A single blossom tucked into the iron bars. A folded paper of seeds slipped beneath the fence. One morning, Clara found them. The maid, carrying laundry, discovered her crouched by the gate, clutching a handful of seeds as though they were gold coins. No one knew how she had slipped outside. Perhaps a servant forgot to lock the back door. But Clara had crossed the threshold at last. George was furious. He tightened security, locked doors, scolded staff. "She cannot be allowed to chase fantasies," he declared. Yet even he could not erase the truth. The girl who had once lived only at her window had stepped into the world beyond it. The estate braced for collapse. Specialists urged more rules, curtains, routine, medication. But Clara resisted. Her silence had turned sharp. When pressed, she simply walked to the window and pointed at the empty garden. Her demand wordless but unmistakable. Bring him back. The breaking point came one stormy evening. Clara refused to eat, refused to move, until finally she wrote a single sentence and slid it beneath her door. "If he is gone, I am gone too." George read it with trembling hands. For a man who had built towers of glass and stone, those 8 words cracked him deeper than any market crash. He realized what no fortune could change. His daughter's healing was not for sale. That night, the storm ripped branches from trees and rattled the mansion like a warning. Clara pressed to her window, whispering into the roar, "Come back." And in the darkness beyond the hedges, a lantern flickered. Samuel had returned. Dismissal had erased his pay, not his promise. He stood once more by the stone bed, lantern steady in his hands, waiting. Clara saw it, her breath breaking into a sound half-sob, half-laugh. For the first time, she flung the sash wide open and cried into the storm. "Here!" The word cut through the night like lightning. It was the first her father heard spoken aloud in his house. The window no longer separated them. It had become a bridge, and no dismissal, no blind, no order could erase what had been born in silence. Some windows are never meant to shut. They wait, like hearts, for the courage to open. The storm that night broke more than branches. It broke silence. For months, Clara had spoken to no one, her voice buried beneath grief and glass. But when she flung her sash wide and cried, "Here!" into the wind, the house itself seemed to shudder. A child who had been locked inside her own silence had finally called into the world. George heard it from the hall. He froze, the whiskey glass slipping from his hand, shattering against marble. For the first time since Clara had entered his home, her voice had filled it. Not a whisper to herself, not a word scribbled on paper, but a cry strong enough to rattle the storm. He ran to her door. She stood at the window, rain blowing against her face, stars of paper trembling above her. Below, Samuel's lantern glowed steady in the square of stones. "Clara!" George's voice cracked. "Come away from the window!" But she did not move. She pointed instead into the night, toward the man who had given her silence an answer. George's anger rose, then faltered. In that moment, he understood. She was not rejecting him. She was reaching for life. And he, with all his wealth and experts and rules, had been the one in her way. The next morning, the storm's wreckage lay across the estate. Branches littered the drive, statues wore crowns of leaves, the fountain overflowed with muddy rain. But in the garden, the square of stones remained intact, lantern soot marking its center like a signature no one could erase. George found Samuel there at dawn, kneeling, relighting the lantern as though nothing had changed. For a long moment, the two men stood in silence, one with hands soft from offices, the other with hands carved by soil. Finally, George said quietly, "She called for you." Samuel nodded once. "She called," he agreed. It was not an accusation. It was truth. That evening, George did something no one expected. He walked with Clara down the grand staircase, through the hall of portraits and to the glass back door. His hand trembled as he unlocked it. For months he had fought to keep her inside, safe but silent. Now he opened the door himself. The air rushed in, damp and sweet with spring. Clara hesitated. Fear gripped her, the same fear that had once dragged her back upstairs. But George knelt, placing his hand over hers. "Go," he whispered. "You don't have to be afraid anymore." Step by step, barefoot, she crossed the threshold. Samuel was waiting by the stone square. He did not move toward her, did not reach to lift her. He only waited, lantern steady. Clara walked across wet grass until she stood before him. For the first time since the fire that had shattered her world, she smiled. Not in a drawing, not in a dream, but in flesh and breath. And then, the sound George had prayed for but could never buy, Clara laughed. It was soft at first, then stronger, spilling into the garden like water breaking through a dam. The laugh carried across the estate, startling birds from branches, silencing even the wind. George, standing in the doorway, pressed his hand to his eyes. He had thought he was giving her a home by building walls of stone and glass. But a home, he realized, was not what he could build. It was what she chose to open. From that day, the golden window remained, but no longer as a prison. Its light shone as invitation. Clara sat by it still, but now, with the sash open, sketches drying in the breeze, her laughter sometimes slipping out into the garden below. Samuel continued to tend the grounds, as steady as ever. George no longer tried to stop him. He had learned that some healing cannot be bought, only witnessed. Seasons turned. The crocus that once defied the frost gave way to pansies, then roses. The little square of stones beneath the window grew into a permanent bed, tended by Samuel's hands, guarded by Clara's smile. Visitors to the estate whispered about it, the place where a gardener and a silent child had begun a conversation without words. And the window? It never closed again. Thank you for listening to the story, The Window That Never Closed. This tale reminds us that love is not built by wealth or rules, but by presence, by showing up quietly, patiently, until someone dares to open their heart again. If this story touched you, please leave a comment and share where in the world you are listening from. And remember, sometimes the smallest act of kindness is the light in someone else's window.